Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Good afternoon to everybody. Since the majority of the speakers today decided to speak in English, I will share in English and a little bit of Italian. Our panel, first of all, I would like to welcome you all to this panel, the speakers and attendees. The panel is about the processes of constitutional degradation. And I remind the speakers that they have 10 minutes to present their paper, and I kindly ask them to respect the time. At the end of all the presentation, there will be some discussion if some questions arise during the presentation. Switching a little bit of the presentation order, we will start with the presentation of Andrea Gatti. Andrea Gatti is a research fellow of public comparative law at the Department of Law at the University of Pisa. He's a PhD at the University of Pisa as well, and please, Mr. Gatti, take the floor.
Adesso mi sentite?
Sì.
Scusate, ho avuto dei problemi, fortunatamente mi ha aiutato la Chiara Cerbone. Eccomi qua, sì, grazie per la presentazione. Scusate, fatemi let me keep my little intervention scheme. I'm gonna speak in English. I'm gonna try to speak in English. Sorry, and I want to apologize with Professor Perini and to any one of you because of these little overlaps, but I'm here, glad to be here. Thanks again to the organizer, and thank you for the understanding for this little switch. I move straight to the point. The purpose of my intervention is to explore to what extent the abuse clause provides interesting insights that might be contribute to a better understanding of the constitutional evolution or involution of European democracies. In fact, several international and regional human rights documents contain an abuse of right clause, just like several European national constitutional order, as Article 18 of the German Basic Law, for example. These clauses are similar to each other's, and this is why, after explaining the nature of the abuse of the right, I will focus my analysis on Article 17 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Also because the ECHR is the most comprehensive example. It enjoys the rank of constitutional law in the majority of the member states, as we all know, as in our country, where it's directly applicable as an additional Bill of Rights. First of all, what does it mean when one refers to the abuse of the right? And why is it so important in our discourse about constitutional degradation? Basically, the core concept of the abuse clause is that nothing in a legal order, in a convention, in a declaration, or in a constitution, nothing can be interpreted in a way that an actor of this order, a state, a movement, an individual, might destroy this very order. We can immediately see that the abuse clause implies a paradox. But there is more. The abuse of the right is actually an inconsistent doctrine founded on a paradoxical concept. The idea that anyone can contradict anything, everything, except the source of his action, the source from what its action acquires legitimacy. To explain that, we can try to apply the idea, the philosophical idea of performative self-contradiction, an idea that is translated from the speech act theory, the philosophical branch, within the legal theoretical system of fundamental freedoms. Performative self-contradiction occurs when an utterance undercuts or compromises the very precondition on which it rests, and therefore destroys its meanings. For example, when someone says, "I claim that I don't exist," the very act of uttering it proves the claim was wrong, as to exist is the precondition of uttering sentences. We can try to borrow, to transplant this concept for our purposes. In the legal order, the clause of prohibition of the abuse of rights, because we talk about abuse of a right, but more precisely is the prohibition of the abuse of the rights, implies, but also in a certain way solves the paradox of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is, as we know, might suffer from being, as we well know, might suffer from being open to its enemies, and human rights, in fact, lend themselves to all kinds of purposes, those as well that are incompatible with liberal democracy. Freedom of speech, for example, technically allows one to argue against free speech, or freedom of association technically covers the founding of parties which object to multi-party, which aims to destroy multi-party democracy. So fundamental rights may be turned against themselves. That is a fact. Let's do some more example. For example, when someone invokes the right to free speech in order to give a talk against the very idea of free speech, doesn't he undercut the very foundation of his action? And from the other side, when the state uses its democratic fundamental values to undermine democracy, isn't it turning the democratic system against itself? So the idea of the prohibition of the abuse of a right, I think it's actually a way out. How? To solve this problem. How? It's a performative self-contradiction. Let's try to make it, because I don't know how much minutes I have, but let's try to get even further, even deeper to my point. Let's immediately take the example of Article 17 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 17 reads, "Nothing in a fundamental rights charter may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activities or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein." From an historical point of view, the aim of the provision of the prohibition of the abuse in the international law was to meet the needs felt by the states parties to redress the balance, so to say, vis-à-vis with their citizen. So the states involved in drafting of the convention were concerned about the loss of sovereignty. With the abuse clause, states have an additional instrument to prevent the rights and freedoms guaranteed in the convention from being misused or interpreted to allow the rise of movements that aim to overthrow their democratic governments. So it's kind of a safety valve for the states. But actually, at the same time, the very provision aims at a symmetrical purpose, to restrict the leeway of the state. So, in some way, to frame its power. So, again, towards the state, Article 17 has two effects with the regard of the respect of the constitutional base of the legal order. Firstly, it prevents the state from using any of the provision of the convention in order to destroy the rights and freedom safeguarded therein. Secondly, it prevents the state parties from relying on these rights and freedom in order to limit the rights of freedoms which that provider safeguards. In both cases, either is directed towards private parties or is directed to state parties, the clause aims to prevent anyone bypassing the law by formally respecting it. By now, we focused on the bright side of the clause, but of course there is a dark side too. The abuse clause hides some risks. It shapes the convention or the constitution where it's embedded as an integral body of principle where the spirit of the charter may override the text. This shows that the clause might be either a perfect instrument to face some specific manifestation of constitutional retrogression or violation of rights of individuals, but at the same time, it might encourage constitutional regression itself. Let's think about the Hungarian Constitution of 2013. Article 7, paragraphs 3 of the Constitution stress that the constitutional freedoms are protected as long as they don't contradict other freedoms. And so far, so good, we can say. Or unless there is a necessity, quote, quoting, to protect constitutional values, unquote. So, of course, those values are fuzzy, and the government has a wide range of interpretation of them. Or even the example recalled before by Professor Bassu on the deprivation of the Turkish citizenship for those members of this association that was presumed to be unconstitutional. So this is for sure a wrong application of the militant democracy abuse clause, prohibition of the abuse clause. Second question might be to understand the extent of the unconstitutional behavior, because we all know that any liberal democracy implies a threshold of tolerance against anti-systemic behavior. Tolerance even towards groups that wants to destroy the system as a whole or reject liberties as a whole. There is, of course, no time to answer this question, but it was important to stress them. So just to conclude, the abuse clause in the European Convention of Human Rights, but in general in every system or legal order, seems to serve a very different purpose. From one side, it appears to restrict fundamental rights, but also serve of citizens or group of citizens, but at the same time, it serves as sanction of states' abuses. And for both these purposes, despite its risks that I stressed before, I underlined before, the concept of abuse of rights may represent nowadays an interesting tool in relation to human rights. It can serve as a corrective mechanism for undesirable outcomes of the exercise of rights of individuals and of powers of the state. But, and I'm really going to conclude it, I also want to make very clear that to be effective, it's central to take into consideration the health of the general political institutional system in the specific order where it is embedded. The more the democratic texture is safe, is guaranteed, the more the abuse clause might be a help for the system. The more the democratic texture is compromised, the more the abuse clause can be a danger for the democracy. This is exactly what Professor De Muro stressed before in the main panel, in the main session, recalling stating that populism arises in society under pressure. So I think this might be a very interesting tool for Europe to calibrate its potential and to face the constitutional retrogression not in terms of systematic perspective, but in terms of specific micro, we can say, I don't know, like kind of microscopic perspective. I concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gatti, for your interesting speech, which highlights one of the very contradiction of our liberal democracies and their ethical relativism. Now we can go to the second speech by Elia Cremona, PhD candidate here at the University of Siena. His speech is about the constitutional degradation, a bottom-up look. Please.
Thank you, Professor Pedrini, and good afternoon to all. So my paper wants to offer a different perspective on the topic of constitutional degradation. As Professor Pedrini said, a bottom-up look, and I'm going to explain it during my speech. So. At the end of the Second World War, there were only 12 constitutional democracies in the world. In 1987, there were 66 out of a total of 193 countries belonging to the United Nations organization. By 2003, there were almost twice as many, 121. And it was widely believed that it was only a matter of time before a global system of constitutional democracy became established. Martin Lowling wrote, there was only one game in town, and the game was constitutional democracy. Then, the failure of the Arab Springs, the consolidation of Putin's sovereign democracy in Russia, the emergence of the illiberal democracies of Poland and Hungary, the growth of populist parties in Europe and around the world have literally put the democratic ideal in crisis, which seems to fade more and more and to be reduced to a formal compliance with procedures, unfortunately difficult to change. The phenomenon has been well described by Tushnet and Ginsburg in 2018. The NGO Freedom House has estimated that the phenomenon of constitutional degradation is occurring in 71 countries, and its latest report in 2021, this year, is entitled The Anti-Democratic Turn. So, as we know, and as we listened in the morning, this is the geopolitical context seen from a high view on the health of democracy globally. But taking a different point of view, a bottom-up look, a sort of civilian perspective, what do we see? The first aspect to consider concerns the ways in which the leaders of the constitutional degradation came to power. The Hungarian case is emblematic. The first electoral victory of the Orbán's coalition was obtained in 2010 through free elections as a result of the collapse of the Social Democratic Party. The mixed electoral system allowed Orbán's coalition to win the 78% of the seats after having obtained the 52% of the total votes. And this magic two-thirds made possible the realization of Orbán's political project, which not even the weakly rigid constitution, Hungarian constitution, could contain. In Poland as well, President Duda was re-elected in 2020 with the 43% of the vote in the first round and the 51% in the runoff. In the US, Trump in 2016 was elected in what is traditionally considered the strongest democracy. So, if it's true that the legitimacy of the operation of almost all these electoral contests has been contested, it is equally true that no fraud has been definitively established today. Therefore, we must, for the moment, take it as given that this leader came to power democratically. The objection that could be made is very easy. Many totalitarians have come to power democratically, and the heart of the constitutional democracy consists precisely in limiting power. Objection accepted. My point here, however, is to ask about the deeper roots of this phenomenon. And I would like to suggest a thesis whereby the constitutional degradation of democratic institution is a reflection of constitutional degradation of a civil society. And to explain this, I must take a step backwards. Already Montesquieu reminded us in the Esprit de Loi how constitutions were the expression of the history and the culture of people, theory of relativity, and that there were no absolute good laws, but only laws in harmony with the historical and geographical context to which they referred. And more recently, Mortati has taught us to consider the Constitution as something more than just the formal text, valuing its historicity and its link with the concrete social context. And today, the material Constitution is considered, as Giovanni Grottanelli de Santi summarized and criticized, as the set of points or moments of stable and not momentary consensus in which an organized society recognizes itself. This idea of an ex post facto constitution is echoed today by the affirmation of the model of civil constitutions devised by Günther Teubner, which well describes the transformation of constitutionalism in the globalized world, and in particular in the digital era. Teubner's theory is based on three fundamental observations that we can concisely summarize here. The first one questions the exclusivity of the relationship between constitutions and the nation states, proposing a reconstruction of the concept of constitution to include not only state constitutions, but also the multiple social constitutions of the autonomous subsystems of the society world. The second observation moves from the recognition of process of self-constitutionalization, understood as the product of higher norms that allocate decision-making powers, regulate the outcomes of their violations, and by analogy with the state constitution, incorporate self-limiting mechanisms to reduce interference with other actors and powers. It's not difficult to see in Facebook, for example, values and principles, as well in the setting up of the Facebook Oversight Board, an example of a form of self-constitutionalization. And finally, the third is the necessary consequence of the first two. The constituent power of social constitutions would be the product of the encounter between the social system and individual consciences. As is well known, Teubner's theory is blamed for being a merely descriptive constitutionalism, whereas constitutionalism is born and lives against the status quo, against constituted power, in the form of a polemical constitutionalism, as Massimo Luciani writes. Teubner's theory, however, has the merit of fully describing the trajectory of postmodern constitutionalism, especially in the digital era. Today, in fact, many believe that this sort of spontaneous constitutions are transforming the form of state of the most consolidated democracies. More and more rights and freedoms are now conditioned by private powers, which derive their legitimacy not from a democratic investor, but from a position of socio-economic strength. And the list is endless, from freedom of expressions to the exercise of civil and political rights, from economic freedoms to social rights, work, health, education. Today, the guarantors of these rights are no longer the states, but the large digital platforms, masters of the most intelligent algorithms in the world. And new arcana imperi emerge, new inscrutable secrets of power, which the citizen, now transformed into users or followers, can't know. Is this not an equally worrying constitutional degradation? And not only that, people seem anxious to give up old rights in order to acquire new commodities. Billions of people do not seem to care about being, for instance, continuously monitored, surveyed by the big tech, and prefer to give up their privacy in order to take advantage of few more free services by Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, etc. A phenomenon of voluntary servitude, as Etienne de la Boétie wrote in 1566, is reproduced in which subjects choose to give up the ownership of certain rights in order to recognize the authority of the sovereign, this time a private subject, to whom the power of surveillance is now attributed. I authorize and give up my right of governing myself, wrote Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan. And this phenomenon has certainly not escaped the attention of scholars of constitutional degradation. Martin Lowry, for example, states that globalization is bringing about a process of emptying out domestic constitutions and converting economic power into political power. So, in my view, this bottom-up degradation converged with the top-down constitutional degradation mentioned at the beginning. And the root of the two phenomena is not so different. In the words of Shakespeare's Giulio Cesare, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. And so what is needed is a reappropriation of the content of constitutions in the individual and collective consciences, enhancing the counter-majoritarian instruments to protect pluralism, but at the same time, recovering the idea of constitution as personal commitment that Piero Calamandra invoked for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elia, for your very fascinating speech, which focused on how, despite our wisdom, we are experiencing global degradation of democracies, looking particularly at this process from the bottom, as you said. That means, as far as I understand, from what happens not only in the public sphere, but especially in the private sectors. Okay, we can go on with the third speech by Mr. Giorgini Pignatello, PhD candidate here at the University of Siena. The expansion of judicial powers, the principle of separation of state powers in the line of fire, psychological evolution of democratic system or prelude to liberal democracies. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much also to the organizing committee for this invitation and your kind presentation. So recently, the constitutional courts of two EU member states, that is Germany and Italy, issued very controversial decisions for the highly political value of the topics involved. On the one hand, the Italian guardians of the Constitution adopted for the first time ever a technique baptized by the doctrine as delayed unconstitutionality, through which the court admonished the legislator to amend within a certain period of time laws deemed unconstitutional. In the face of the parliament's inertia, the Corte Costituzionale had to act in place of the elected assemblies and to establish a new legal framework. It eventually decriminalized determined conducts related to sensitive subjects, such as bioethics and freedom of information. On the other hand, the Bundesverfassungsgericht issued in May 2021 the decision on the Federal Climate Protection Act, the Klimaschutzgesetz. In particular, the German legislator required the federal government to set, in 2025, annually decreasing emission budgets for period after 2030. Challenged directly by individuals, thanks to the Verfassungsbeschwerde, the Bundesverfassungsgericht declared the act partially unconstitutional, insofar as it lacks sufficient specifications for further emission reductions from 2031 onwards. Compliant to Article 28 of the Grundgesetz, and in accordance with the Paris target, the Bundesverfassungsgericht required the legislator to enact by the end of 2022 more detailed provisions on how to reach the above-mentioned reduction targets for greenhouse gas emissions. The transformation that constitutional courts at issue have been experiencing in their almost 70 years of operation has attracted several criticism. The fear of the rise of a juristocracy has been growing in the last decades. As a matter of fact, different legal experiences proved how activism of constitutional courts can easily contribute to degrading democracy into an authoritarian order, where the state powers merge and magistrates of constitutional courts and Supreme Courts pursue or support political goals. The proactive role that constitutional courts have been progressively acquiring in many liberal democracies must take into account other remarkable factors. While on the one hand, a widespread crisis of the legislative power is occurring, on the other, governments are committed to keep the popular consent and to manage issues that are increasingly taking on a global dimension, thus weakening their sovereignty. In this regard, although Amstelsen's idea of constitutional courts as negative legislators is still effective, in the contemporary form of state, society's evolution and its quest for rights entailed radical changes in the dynamics among public institutions. Especially in countries characterized by what the doctrine described as transformative constitutionalism, many constitutional courts interpreted their role as being entitled to question the legitimacy of legislative omissions. The purpose is to ensure the effectiveness of constitutional guarantees and rights, codified in the rigid constitutions, which threw down the challenge of setting a wide and ambitious range of objectives aimed at realizing a real social transformation. This is why, when gaps in the legislation are deemed unconstitutional, the guardians of the Constitution felt entitled to reprimand the lawmakers' unresponsiveness by directly recognizing the underdeveloped rights. In this case, the judge of the laws replaces the legislature's activity by filling the legal void. Since a potential expansion of the powers of constitutional courts might represent a dangerous sign of constitutional degradation, understanding whether this constitutes a physiological evolution or a pathological deterioration of constitutional democracy requires further investigation. Only by doing so, we will be able to promptly and properly address potential emergent issues. One might wonder whether the leading position in the safeguard and the promotion of fundamental rights taken by non-majoritarian actors, such as courts, is conflicting with the principle of separation of powers, which represents the core of constitutionalism. The contribution thus aims at exploring two questions. First, are we witnessing an expansion of the powers of constitutional courts? And if so, does this pose a threat to liberal constitutional democracy? So after the collapse of the authoritarian regimes in Europe, it was clear for the constitution makers that the people's level of education, the quality of the laws, and the democratic nature of institutions were not elements sufficient per se for ensuring the existence of a liberal democracy with a social dimension. This was the lesson that the failure of the Weimar Republic taught to the world. Therefore, democratic constitutions require a supremacy status within the order. Constitutional adjudication became then the legal mechanism through which ensuring the protection of fundamental rights against the tyranny of the will of political majority. In addition, human dignity and the principle of substantial equality guaranteed through a wide welfare state were the cornerstones on which post-conflict constitutional democracies were built. The struggle for concretizing these principles implied a constant evolution of the legal space, whose consequence was an increase of its complexity following the intricacy of contemporary society. Further factors, such as legal pollution, blatant defection of legislation towards courts when it's time to take unpopular decisions, the juridification of social spheres, as well as the creation of a multi-level system for the protection of people's rights, made courts the new protagonists of the current era. This is why, when analyzing the role played by constitutional courts in contemporary legal orders, to take into consideration concepts such as the idea of courts as bouche de la loi is anachronistic. Contrary to Montesquieu's theories, contemporary constitutionalism requires also non-majoritarian institutions to have a proactive lead in the pursuit of constitutional values and goals. After the Second World War, Germany and Italy, for example, imported the US model of checks and balances. Therefore, powers are called to loyally cooperate in order to ensure the full implementation of the Constitution and its values. These are the theoretical grounds that legitimize the substitution of one power by another in the exercise of their functions when the former fails to fulfill its constitutionally established rules and duties. Since the 50s, the German doctrine has been digging into and questioning the concept of the omissions of the legislator in a legal order where the Constitutional Court soon became a really dominant actor among the public powers. The Bundesverfassungsgericht has been facing the topic of legislative omissions since the very beginning of its activity. In a 1951 decision, it established that the obligation to comply with the Constitution, and in particularly with the Grundrechte, might entail the right of a specific duty to act for judicial and administrative bodies. It also stated that non-compliance with these obligations could lead to an unconstitutional omission, a situation which would be detrimental for fundamental rights. However, in this first stage, the Bundesverfassungsgericht recognized that the legislature's inaction could not per se generate a sanctionable unconstitutional omission. Just a few years later, the Bundesverfassungsgericht overruled its case law and affirmed that in case of absolute omissions, the court is entitled to fill the gaps and elaborate a rule which, until that time, had been understood to require an interpositio legislatoris for its full effectiveness. By the end of the 50s, the Bundesverfassungsgericht said that unconstitutionality can derive not only by legislators' positive actions, but also due to the legislative omissions. The guardians of the Constitution acknowledged that the Grundgesetz can be violated by legislators' inaction, especially when an arbitrary exclusion of benefits occurs, thus infringing the principle of equality. In addition, during its activity, the Bundesverfassungsgericht has been developing new typologies of decisions, other than just acceptance or rejection of the raised question of constitutional legitimacy. This happened both to safeguard the discretionary power of the legislature and to avoid the abdication of court's functions. Decisions directly addressing the legislator, the declarations of inconstitutionality without annulment, decisions of constitutional interpretation, all constitutes mechanisms of judicial engineering. So, the new trend, and I'm going to conclude, the new trend inaugurated by the Italian Constitutional Court with a decision in Cappato to keep both control over the challenged legal framework that is strongly suspected of unconstitutionality and to give the legislature proper time to act according to its duties, relies within a physiological evolution of the relationship among the state powers. Since the 50s and the 70s, the Bundesverfassungsgericht sanctions legislative omission and modulated the effects of its decision in time. This did not prevent Germany to be considered still nowadays a consolidated democracy with a respected system of constitutional adjudication and the provision of high standards for people's rights. This is the end of my conclusion. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much to Giorgio Pignatiello. He highlights a third contradiction of our constitutional democracies, especially focusing on the role of our constitutional court that are considered one of the bedrock of to protect our constitutional democracy. There is something that reminds me a very old book by Edouard Lambert, Le gouvernement des juges et la lutte contre la législation sociale aux États-Unis in 1921. Let's go to the next speech by Adrian Rubio, who is a PhD candidate at the European University Institute in Florence, right? And now is visiting at the DPEC. And his speech is about the decline of consultative bodies in executive decision-making, a sign of constitutional degradation. Please.
Grazie, Professore Perini. consultative bodies play a balancing and moderating role in constitutional democracies. Contrary to the three-power doctrine, advisory institutions with their reports and opinions lack an immediate relationship with citizens. However, despite the supportive and auxiliary nature of their activity vis-à-vis the decision makers, their constitutional functions are far from being irrelevant. In many cases, the law requires the executive power to request an advisory opinion from these institutions. Decision makers, therefore, are supported by unelected actors that may alter the outcome of the executive decisions. Given the non-majoritarian nature of the consultative organs, the executive power can rely on technical experts on the field that enrich the political decisions with extra political input. Moreover, even if some of these bodies have a clear legal character, they lack the majoritarian character that derives from elections and their legitimacy. More recently, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic by several European governments, including the EU authorities, has presented an important challenge to executive decision-making in several fields: healthcare, public order, security, or even the limitation of fundamental rights. Indeed, the classical tension between political and technical leadership has reoccupied the centre of public discourse, with some favouring decisions that took solely public health concerns into consideration, while others censor the alleged democratic deficit of allowing unelected experts to make those important decisions. Besides scientists not being subject to direct political accountability, this view claims that politicians waive their responsibility by avoiding the balancing of conflicting interests, which seems to be a key component of executive decisions. What I'm trying to do here is to problematize the role that consultative and expert bodies play in Europe, especially in connection to the executive's duty to motivate their decisions in the COVID-19 framework. Whereas it is uncontested that dismissing contrary advisory opinions threats the constitutional equilibrium when the institutional design of policy requires the government to request legal or technical advice, my hypothesis is that the executive authorities do not exhaust their obligations by merely referring per relazione to the recommendations of consultative bodies, and thus raise crucial questions in terms of transparency and accountability. If ever we lived in an age of executive dominance, it is also now, during the current pandemic and in relation to core state power, meaning public health. Executive power, as in any emergency, declared or not, is at the core of managing and planning and enforcing policy, with a prioritization of evidence-based decision-making within or to the political executive. It is impossible, and most people recognize that it is impossible, to make rational political decisions in complex societies without relying extensively on expert advice and even expert decisions. Different kinds of expertise are seen as essential for addressing complex problems and for managing high-paced technological change. Expert executive power raises many questions about the nature and the impact of the surrounding political and legal orders. Experts within the executive branch have considerable knowledge and information gathering advantage over the legislative and judicial branches of government. This can result in a weakening of other branches of government. Parliaments become, now quite literally, remote, and courts, at worst onlookers, at best incidental or tardy adjudicators, generally at the margins. Knowledge-based decision-making and the role of expertise and scientific evidence are not something one can be for or against per se, but rather something that is more or less legitimate or illegitimate, depending on more specific organization and practice of actors. Citizens seem to accept decision-making as legitimate and place trust in procedures and institutions that privilege experts and expert opinions, an acceptance and trust that is intimately linked to modern society's functional expert dependency or the fact of expertise. At the same time, the authority of professional scientists and science and the powers of the unelected appears as more contested. Experts are not generally considered to provide input legitimacy to political systems, but rather they have other functions. Expert advice and input into political processes is supposed to improve the quality of the actual decisions taken in line with output legitimacy. If expertise fails in this function, a legitimacy problem occurs. Granting political and/or advisory power to experts may be defensible, but generally only on the grounds that it contributes to enlightening political processes and facilitates problem solving. In the regulatory state powers were exercised by non-majoritarian institutions or agencies with the expertise for fact-finding, rule-making, and enforcement. To be a desirable form of rule, democracy must have procedures with truth-tracking or truth-sensitive qualities that contribute to improving decisions. that a normative defense of democracy must also refer to the intrinsic moral value of democratic procedures. It follows from this that the organization and institutionalization of expert arrangements within such systems must both fulfill certain democratic procedural requirements and score well on performance parameters. Every crisis in history almost inevitably front stages different types of expertise. For example, we see post 9/11, the national security experts and law enforcement agents. During the financial crisis, it was the economists, the ones who had the solutions, the answers to the questions that we all had in Europe. With the refugee crisis, it was mostly lawyers who guaranteed human rights protection. During the current crisis, it's clear that the public health emergency requires medical scientific experts, and they have played an absolutely key role in national executive power in Europe, but also at a supranational level, at the EU level, intertwined with the political decision-making, even in the face of great uncertainty and lack of clarity, as well as true scale of risk. In some jurisdictions, the medical scientific expert, it is claimed, has metamorphosed the government advisor into actual decision maker, although generally the dividing line between the two remains blurred and the actual decisions remain taken at the political level. This is actually the case of the EU, at least with decisions being taken by the political executive as opposed to Parliament and on the basis of expert scientific input. The regulatory state, also the EU, has delegated powers to specialized agencies and committees staffed by perfectly neutral experts, partly based on the argument that they can carry out policies with a level of efficiency and effectiveness that politicians cannot match. Question is whether in the realm of the core state powers of one kind or another, a different rationale and or practice applies and should apply. During this COVID-19 crisis, we saw that there were two basic lines of reaction. First, one involving declaring the state of emergency or the state of alarm in some member states, and others not declaring it, but mostly because it was legally possible, like the case of Germany or the EU as a whole. In both lines of reaction, the intensification and accumulation of executive power is striking. In both instances, secrecy and a certain amount of legal informality or rushed decision-making was evident, certainly in the initial reactions. The role of the EU was from the early days of the crisis a different one. It cannot declare a health emergency. Its role was largely supportive, one to the member states attempting in various fields to coordinate action in several critical respects, but also to develop, for example, tracking apps, travel lists, even the receipt of vaccination certificates. These actions harden into some specific measures that have gotten to be new, highly significant instruments with considerable power for the Commission. A lot of the scholarly discussion to date has been on the expansion of executive power and the effects on the role of parliaments as an important part of the response to the COVID-19 emergency. Much less analysis, however, was paying attention to the role of scientists in government decision-making. Yet within the executive powers of almost all states in Europe and beyond, executive power has been concentrated in the hands of a small group. In the case of Italy, where we are right now, is the Comitato Tecnico Scientifico, set up the 5th of February 2020 with a decree by the Chief of Civil Protection. It is composed, as we know, of experts and representatives of state administrations. The core resource that enables these scientific experts to perform their role is their medical scientific expertise. They are what Sustain refers as the most knowledgeable branch of party. Their specialized knowledge and expertise bring with it status, reputation, the perception of objectivity, independence. This imbues them with authority and credibility in the public domain. And also they form part of a public debate in an asymmetric manner with other participants. It has also been called the rise of autocratic technocracy. In this autocratic technocracy, medical scientists are the technocrats. The reasons why they're considered autocratic is that they can be considered to exist in a type of executive bubble with considerable knowledge and information gathering advantage over accountability fora, like parliaments, of course, for example, that could offer some checks. They are perceived to have pure motives, especially when compared to political, business, and commercial interests. When this is coupled with complex and highly technical decisions which have to be made on the basis of incomplete and shifting information, their discretion is even greater and potentially without bounds. This phenomenon, of course, is not new. Scientists often become the actual decision makers in practice. In most cases, it seems that medical experts function as advisor and not as actual decision maker, and some governments even have made a point in overruling specific, far-reaching and public advice by the medical scientists in the case of Ireland. Now states the expert transitions from advisor to decision maker and combines unfinished the reputation and trustworthiness of their profession with the imprimatur and power of the state. It can be hard for governments to ignore advice from persons they have put forward as experts. This can also be very limiting for public debate and true deliberation. So, what am I asking here? What is the main question that we still need to do some research on? Basically, what could be the role of the legislative research on this? Most jurisdictions in the EU legal space include a specific requirement to motivate those decisions that deviate from the expert recommendations. One may argue that this is for the sake of transparency, but transparency is a necessary but insufficient condition for accountability. Citizen accountability through transparency is often an illusion. On the other hand, media and other stakeholders can and do use transparency to force change in reality. In this context, I contend that transparency should be increasingly understood not as a coherent normative ideal, but as a means for a more granular description of processes of government and governance. And this is precisely where the challenge for constitutional democracies rests. That is, the rising denaturalization and subsequent erosion of the role of the executive powers vis-à-vis the consultative and technical organs. If the process of government is replaced by merely sanction of technical and expert reports, perhaps the executive is withdrawing one of its central functions, basically to make choices, within the limits of legality, of course, even if unpopular decisions, but that they can justify with reasons understood by the public. Unlike experts, however, the executive power enjoys the legitimacy to represent all interests involved in decision-making, not just the sectorial ones embodied by particular experts' fora. The requirement to motivate decisions should extend to a clear justification for choosing some reports before others. For this choice already expresses de facto a concrete understanding of public utility at a specific time and for a concrete scenario. In this balancing exercise, based on knowledge, but also on political priorities, that characterizes the executive power. Depriving it from one or the other without transparent and understandable reasoning may damage its legitimacy.
Thank you, Mr. Rubio, for your very illuminating paper about consultative bodies of the executives and their roles. I remember a quite old paper by Stewart, who was an administrative lawyer in United States of America, the Reformation of American Administrative Law published in Harvard Law Review in 1975, who started to analyze the different models in the United States of administration and focuses on the expertise model that appeared during the Roosevelt era. Nowadays, I think that it is now acquired that the very existence of this expertise model, and your paper seems to me that try to analyze which could be the role of this expertise in the administration and the executive, and especially from the point of view of degradation of our liberal democracies. Thank you very much. Before going on, I would like to ask to the audience if they have any questions to start writing down on the chat the question for our speakers. So the next speech is by Andrea Vernata, and Andrea Vernata will talk about the governing bodies and representative assembly. Time for a new balance. Sorry, I made a mistake. It's okay. The next one is by yes, because it's by Nicole Pignataro. Nicole Pignataro is PhD candidate at the University of Bologna. Sorry, I forgot her. And the speech is about constitutional degradation in time of coronavirus. Please, Ms. Pignataro. And,
No worries, no worries. So thank you, Professor, and thank you to the organizers. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you to share some of my concerns on the effects of specific institutional arrangements on the process of constitutional degradation. So the COVID-19 pandemic exposed with great clarity how the institutional asset that was set to manage the global health emergency mostly represents an hyperbole of an already existing process of the weakening of parliaments. Indeed, the pandemic acted as an accelerator of pre-existing trends that see an overall dominance of governments over legislative bodies, and for a myriad of reasons, they are increasingly struggling to exercise parliamentary control over executive power. To support this thesis, I used the United Kingdom and Italy as two case studies. They are two European parliamentary democracies that are characterized by a fiduciary relationship between government and at least one chamber of parliament. Neither of the two have a constitutionally enshrined emergency regime, and they adopted specific institutional arrangements to manage the health crisis, which did not necessarily include a prior involvement of the legislative body. So an overview of the legal framework and the legal instruments that the two legal orders used to face the pandemic highlighted a common trend in both legal orders, and that is the preference for executive lawmaking to manage the emergency. So delegated legislation and particularly statutory instruments in the United Kingdom, whereas statutory decrees in Italy. Prime Minister decrees are briefly discussed in the paper, but they're not the main object of the study. I stress that the use of statutory instruments in the UK and the use, or as is more commonly said, the abuse of statutory decrees in Italy are pre-existing issues extensively explored by scholarship. So the paper sheds light on specific structural weaknesses of the two constitutional arrangements, which are evident in both exceptional and ordinary times, and that relate to both Parliament's difficulties in keeping up with the executive's lawmaking activity. The problems do not necessarily lie in the fact that Parliament exercises its powers only at a later stage, but rather in the legislative body's very limited possibility of effectively scrutinizing the executive's decisions. In the cases at hand, this is well depicted by the extent to which the two parliaments managed to oversee the executive's activity during the pandemic, making evident that both parliaments showed severe signs of distress in their oversight functions. In the United Kingdom, for example, British scholars advance the view that one of the pre-existing tensions that was mostly exacerbated during the pandemic was the lack of accountability over delegated lawmaking. And the House of Lords Constitution Committee was already expressing its concerns about statutory instruments well before the pandemic. We can just look at one of its 2018 reports where it states that, and I quote, "Parliamentary scrutiny over statutory instruments was considered inadequate." One of the greatest issues about delegated legislation lies in the fact that although Parliament can approve or reject a statutory instrument, and although it can raise objections and require ministers to account, there is rarely any significant prospect of regulations not being approved. This is precisely why some have argued that parliamentary accountability during the emergency was more apparent than real. Another issue is that Parliament has little to no power to amend regulations, implying that statutory instruments embody the will and the policy of government only, and not of Parliament. And the inability of either house to propose amendments to improve delegated legislation consequently entails that Parliament's scrutiny generally focuses on broad contours or on very specific drafting concerns. In Italy instead, the main legal instruments that were used to manage the pandemic were statutory decrees, prime minister decrees, provisions of the Civil Protection Code of 2018, and exceptional ordinances. Just a very small parenthesis, although the terms law decrees and decree laws are mostly used by scholarship, I decided to use the term statutory decrees because it was the one adopted in the Oxford Compendium of National Responses to COVID-19, which was recently published. And although Prime Minister decrees have caught the attention of most scholars due to its peculiar nature and to its extensive use throughout the pandemic, I decided to focus on statutory decrees only as they are everything but exceptional in the Italian legal order. It's sufficient to say that more than half of primary legislation is adopted through these normative acts. And the way government used statutory decrees throughout the emergency perfectly illustrates the entire spectrum of issues that evolve around this legislative instrument, underscoring that Parliament's ability to engage in effective scrutiny is significantly limited by issues which not only relate to how the executive exercises its statutory decree-making powers, but also to the general relationship between Parliament and government. So I decided to focus on 4 specific issues, the first one of which relates to time constraints. As you all know, statutory decrees have to be transposed into statute within 60 days from their enactment. And due to this time constraint, only one of the 2 houses has the real possibility of amending statutory decrees. This means that amendments are introduced and approved by the house that first starts the reading, and they are rarely modified by the other. This is why scholars are increasingly talking about an inclination towards a de facto monocameralism. The second issue relates to government's well-consolidated habit of using maxi amendments followed by a question of confidence. In this case, Parliament's role as a pressuring body is strictly limited, especially since the question of confidence entails that any discussion regarding amendments is completely precluded. Furthermore, Parliament's prerogatives at this point are reduced to little more than ratifying executive proposals. Both maxi amendments and the question of confidence were widely used throughout the pandemic, but it would be unfair to say that the latter can be qualified as an abuse of the legislative process on behalf of government only. Indeed, for the past years, Parliament has been fueling this degenerative practice by using the conversion process as a key moment to satisfy political requests, which not only go beyond the bill's content, but also gravely inflate the bill's dimension. Fourth point I wanted to focus on was the fact that the executive issued a long series of statutory decrees which followed one another in a continuous and connected manner, so much so that scholars have depicted the emergency legislation, and I quote again, as a normative chain. Consequently, the content of statutory decrees under examination by the houses was often merged into the law transposing another statutory decree. At a constitutional law level, this practice raises concerns in relation to the temporary nature of statutory decrees, the unconstitutionality of the reiteration of statutory decrees, as well as the requirement that amendments introduced during the conversion phase must strictly adhere to the subject matter of the statutory decree. And these issues matter, both the ones relating to delegated legislation in the United Kingdom, as well as the ones relating to the way statutory decrees are used in Italy matter, and they matter because Parliament's inability to oversee government gives rise to another series of problems, which relate more generally to the institutional arrangement of a parliamentary democracy. Indeed, oversight is a permanent and multi-purpose function of Parliament that is embedded in the confidence relationship and comprises the limiting and sharing of executive power. And these issues especially matter because parliamentary control over executive power is a core feature of constitutional liberal democracies, even more so if they are parliamentary forms of government. Because parliamentary control preserves the rule of law, and because Parliament represents a public arena where complaints and issues can and they must be voiced. So to guarantee that Parliament remains a standing pillar of democratic representation, I advance the view that the 2 legislative bodies should reinforce and explore old as well as new instruments, ultimately trying to counterbalance the executive's increasing monopoly over decision-making. And an interesting instrument that is receiving increasing attention both within and without institutions is post-legislative scrutiny, which is understood as the possibility for Parliament to assess the law in place against what it was designed to achieve, so not against what Parliament would have preferred. And this perhaps could be interesting also to connect myself with what Adrian Rubio was saying, but in a different context, so from Parliament's perspective. This post-legislative scrutiny would give a new dimension to the legislative process, embracing the idea that approving law should not be seen as the end of the process. This instrument may be seen as an instrumental tool for the purposes of oversight of the executive, aiming at making the government politically responsible and accountable before Parliament for how laws have been implemented, but it would also serve Parliament's attempt to exercise influence over the executive. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pignataro, for your very detailed and fairly argumented speech, which highlighted how the COVID-19 has been an accelerator of pre-existing trends to executive supremacy over Parliament. Unfortunately, for the Italian, is a rather long-standing trend of this kind of supremacy, especially in the normative production. Let's go to the next speech. Parlerò in italiano, visto che il nostro prossimo relatore parlerà anche in italiano. Si tratta di Andrea Vernata, è ricercatore di tipo A alla Sapienza di diritto costituzionale, è capo ufficio legislativo dei gruppi parlamentari presso la Camera dei Deputati e il suo intervento riguarderà governing bodies and representative assemblies, time for a new balance. Prego, signor.
Grazie professor Perini, la ringrazio, grazie a lei organizzatore, al comitato scientifico e in particolare a Milani, Carlino e Cedrone che hanno avuto molta pazienza con me, soprattutto per il rispetto dei termini. E cercherò di essere molto sintetico nella mia relazione per motivi di tempo. Il tentativo era cercare di capire questa constitutional degradation come potesse essere definita e in base a quale linee di tendenza. La prima, ripeto, vado rapidamente, è la complessità e la globalizzazione, due effetti che lei ha citato degli studi, appunto, la letteratura americana negli anni 70 è tutta innervata del discorso sull'expertise, la policy analysis e così via. Sicuramente è uno dei primi aspetti che mi sembra di poter annoverare fra le motivazioni per cui gli assetti istituzionali democratici occidentali tendono a uno sbilanciamento oggi verso un esecutivo, possiamo dire in prima battuta adesso verso il governo. Questo perché? Perché il governo ha la possibilità si appoggia su un apparato molto ampio, strutturato, un funzionariato abile, preparato. Inoltre le dinamiche intergovernative, le connessioni anche di natura economica e commerciale richiedono appunto un certo tipo di know-how, mettiamola così, interconnessioni e interdipendenze che possono sembrare banali o esulare dal carattere costituzionale, ma se si pensa alla tematica del canale di Suez e quanto ha allarmato le politiche della BCE in tema di inflazione, quel blocco e quelle catene di approvvigionamento just in time, si comprende come poi tutte queste dinamiche abbiano un loro peso non indifferente. Sono interlocutori naturali dei processi di globalizzazione, i governi, godono di un margine di azione sicuramente più ampio delle assemblee rappresentative perché rispondono in maniera molto più diluita ai principi di pubblicità e trasparenza, sia pure con alcuni distinguo fra ordinamenti, penso ad esempio sulla comunicazione istituzionale, e abbiamo, è stato detto da chi mi ha preceduto, delle assemblee rappresentative sempre meno reattive. Sempre meno reattive perché? Perché i processi di verticalizzazione, se ne parla da 30 anni almeno, hanno portato a una certa subalternità dei rappresentanti rispetto alle leadership, una subalternità che risente banalmente o nell'ostracizzazione dal processo mediatico istituzionale, come direbbe il professor Rescigno, oppure per il fatto di semplicemente non poter essere garantiti nelle proprie ambizioni politiche nel proseguo e nella successiva campagna elettorale. Questo porta le prerogative di indirizzo e controllo a un esercizio veramente supple, ma soprattutto quelle di controllo, perché non è un novero di rappresentanti che può andare a guardare, oltre perché non ha i mezzi tecnici per farlo, non ha anche spesso la volontà politica di farlo. Ciò però ha un riflesso su un piano più ampio, non è solo un rafforzamento tout court del governo, ma è un rafforzamento, è una sedimentazione del potere in seno all'esecutivo, un esecutivo inteso in senso ampio, un esecutivo, faccio riferimento a organismi, autorità indipendenti che aumentano, la scorsa settimana è stata istituita l'Agenzia per la Cyber Security, un'ennesima autorità indipendente in un tema così delicato, e questa moltiplicazione di organismi tecnici in qualche modo fa sì che il raggio d'azione degli esecutivi, appunto, possa diventare più forte, più forte e più incisivo rispetto al passato. Perché? Perché in qualche modo il governo sicuramente esercita è diventato l'epicentro della produzione normativa, e questo lo registriamo in tutti i paesi, ma soprattutto perché anche in quei paesi che si erano dotati, le cui assemblee rappresentative siano dotate di strutturazioni per andare a vedere le carte del governo o del presidente, stanno vivendo un loro depotenziamento. Pensa agli Stati Uniti, cui il corpo di funzionariato si è ridotto di 2/3 negli ultimi 30 anni. Ciò si verifica, tende a verificarsi, io ovviamente che ho preso a esame, indipendentemente dai meccanismi di spoil system. Questo perché? Perché anche quando vi è uno spoil system si attinge da personalità e soggetti che sono determinati. È un insieme molto ristretto e molto preparato, che appunto funge da vero e proprio filtro di informazione rispetto al governo. È un governo quindi che esercita un'istruttoria molto debole, in cui è dipendente dalle informazioni, dai dati, dalle risultanze, dalle analisi che gli derivano dall'esecutivo, e inoltre che risente del fatto che i vertici amministrativi, le autorità indipendenti, eccetera, esulano dal processo di legittimazione democratica e possono garantire una certa continuità sul piano delle politiche nazionali. Questo è guardato ovviamente con favore rispetto ai processi di globalizzazione, perché se il governo può dare certezze, quante ne può dare di più un esecutivo? E ciò fa sì inevitabilmente che l'esecutivo e non l'assemblea rappresentativa diventi il principale e naturale interlocutore del governo. Questo ovviamente ha due riflessi. Sul piano almeno due, sul piano dei processi di globalizzazione si ha una tendenza degli operatori globali, possiamo chiamare così, poi rinvio alla relazione, al testo scritto per approfondimenti, a rivolgersi direttamente agli esecutivi o comunque alle autorità amministrative indipendenti, agli organismi tecnici. Penso per i miei studi all'Ufficio parlamentare di bilancio, che per verificare i conti del Ministero dell'Economia e Finanze comunque si basa su organismi privati, cioè ha bisogno in qualche modo di interloquire con altri soggetti. E lo fa direttamente, non lo fa più per il tramite del governo. Sul piano della forma di governo, laddove c'è il rapporto di fiducia, vi è un'inversione. Non è più un governo che ha bisogno della fiducia delle Camere, ma in qualche modo sono le Camere che inseguono la fiducia del governo. È un governo che però dal suo punto di vista ha difficoltà a portare avanti le sue politiche nazionali per le ragioni che dicevamo, cioè non è libero, da un certo punto di vista abbiamo detto da un lato c'è una destrutturazione delle strutture politiche, diciamo di accompagnamento politico, dall'altro c'è il venir meno della strutturazione del partito, per come lo si conosceva almeno fino all'inizio degli anni 90, e questo fa sì che ci sia una certa dipendenza anche sul piano della forma di governo. Questa preminenza delle politiche governative poi risente ovviamente di quella subalternità di cui accennavo prima, cioè in qualche modo c'è un'oggettiva difficoltà per l'assemblea rappresentativa, per il rischio di una crisi di governo, oppure di contrapporsi alla sovraesposizione mediatica del leader, può avere un costo politico molto ampio che in qualche modo può portare a prendere altre vie. Tutte queste tendenze che si conoscono, diciamo, se ne parla da anni, a mio modo di vedere oggi assumono un nuovo significato per un evento, se vogliamo, epocale. C'è un nuovo blocco egemonico, parlo della Cina, c'è un nuovo blocco egemonico che è economicamente indipendente e immune, diciamo, dalle economie occidentali, dalle democrazie costituzionali occidentali, ma fondamentale per quest'ultime. Questo penso alla Belt and Road Initiative, cioè ci sono una serie di iniziative, di progetti che in qualche modo aumentano la sfera di influenza di questo nuovo blocco, e questo ha portato, questa contrapposizione, possiamo dire, di visioni del mondo, di blocchi egemonici parlerei, però sono forse datate le espressioni, sta cambiando il tipo di concorrenza che esiste fra la sfera, diciamo, occidentale e quella cinese, perché se prima si parlava di contrapposizione di tipo economico, ci si sarebbe potuti aspettare che, vabbè, sostanzialmente attuano la programmazione economica, noi ce l'abbiamo provata, non è andata bene, abbiamo deciso di riaffermare i paradigmi del mercato. Lì c'è una finalizzazione del mercato, recentemente è stato adottato il codice civile e proprio per ragioni storiche non ha risentito dell'intermediazione dei codici napoleonici, però innerva, in quanto successivo, innerva delle finalità costituzionali, è molto interessante questo dal punto di vista costituzionale, e c'è stato, cioè, c'era un modo di vedere diverso l'economia, quindi programmazione economica contro libero mercato, mancata finalizzazione del mercato e finalizzazione del mercato. Ci tengo a precisare, non scendo nel merito, rilevo l'impostazione diversa che c'è fra i due blocchi. Questo ha portato un'esacerbazione delle crisi, negli ultimi 30 anni se ne sono affrontate tante, politiche, economiche e sociali. C'è un modello europeo che e occidentali, perché penso anche agli Stati Uniti, che è in crisi, è fortemente in crisi perché qualcosa ce lo dice la Corte Costituzionale, il patto intergenerazionale si sta rompendo, i livelli di disoccupazione aumentano, le diseguaglianze si acutizzano, e davanti a tutto questo le opzioni erano due, appunto: provare a dare una finalità al mercato o non farlo. Per ora si è scelto di non farlo, se non con qualche sfumatura per il climate change e le politiche del Green Deal. C'è stata un'altra però torsione, e questo è il nuovo significato che secondo me è interessante nel processo di constitutional degradation, il fatto che si sia passati a una concorrenza, dicevo prima, di tipo politico. Cioè si comincia a vedere, a registrare negli ordinamenti costituzionali occidentali l'idea che questo nuovo blocco egemonico va bene perché non risente delle forme, dei limiti e dei procedimenti democratici. Quindi in qualche modo il pluralismo viene visto come un ostacolo, un orpello che blocca la nuova competizione. Il vero responsabile di tutto quello che sta succedendo, diciamo, sul piano economico, e quindi si riaccede a una visione contrappositiva che, come tutte le visioni contrappositive, riporta in auge istanze identitarie, plebiscitarie. C'è una visione del consenso che in qualche modo diventa buona a fare tutto, un consenso salvifico, una legittimazione democratica che consente e giustifica, in nome del furor populi, anche il superamento di procedimenti e forme e limiti democratici. Con una differenza: da costituzionalisti dobbiamo rilevare che quelle forme, quei limiti e quei procedimenti sono un presidio ben preciso, sono un presidio del pluralismo, sono un presidio della garanzia dei diritti, sono un presidio democratico a tutti gli effetti. Ora vado alle conclusioni. Mi sembra che per vedere quale sarà l'esito di questo processo di constitutional degradation, bisogna capire quale sarà il ruolo che eserciterà il consenso, si deciderà di far esercitare al consenso nei prossimi anni. Da un lato c'è la possibilità di ricorrere al consenso per legittimare un superamento di un assetto appunto considerato datato, il cui superamento si giustifica per ragioni economiche. Bisogna aumentare i livelli occupazionali, bisogna contrastare, non so che, insomma, in qualche modo anche eventualmente torsioni sovraniste o comunque visioni ireniche del cosmopolitismo. Si può giustificare qualsiasi cosa. Oppure si può ricreare un consenso attorno a quello che è lo statuto teorico del costituzionalismo moderno: limitazione del potere, formazione del potere, limitazione del potere, garanzia, aggiungo, effettiva dei diritti. E attraverso questa riaffermazione dello statuto teorico non è detto, e probabilmente non sarà possibile, mi limito a dire, non è detto che si potrà contrastare questa nuova egemonia mondiale, ma sicuramente si potrà riaffermare la centralità della persona e della società negli ordinamenti costituzionali, e riaffermare il pluralismo come valore fondante delle costituzioni, degli ordinamenti costituzionali democratici. Sono andato molto rapido, ho tagliato molti passaggi, ripeto, rinvio al testo scritto per approfondimenti. Intanto grazie.
queste prospettive di costitutional degradation, esaminando i rapporti Parlamento-Esecutivo e i processi interni a queste istituzioni. Now we turn to the last speech by Giuseppe Naglieri. Giuseppe Naglieri is PhD candidate at the University of Bari. His speech is about the gerrymandering in United States of America, and the title is Overturning the Pillars of Democratic Representation, Partisan Gerrymandering and the Impact of the Modern Technology-Based Redistricting Processes on the Constitutional Order. Brief notes on Ruccio's fallouts. Please, Mr. Naglieri, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this moment of discussion and to the chair for giving me the floor. Well, I'm briefly going to address the impact of modern technologies on the map-making process, and more accurately, on the well-known manipulative practices that fall under the popular expression gerrymandering. In July 2019, in the case Ruccio versus Common Cause, the Supreme Court has definitely shut the door of federal courts to partisan gerrymandering. Again, after a decade, it found the question to be non-justiciable under the political question doctrine, since the impossibility of finding a judicially manageable standard. The reasoning of the majority opinion in Ruccio, essentially grounded on the older formalist arguments of Justice Antonin Scalia, overrode the impact of modern partisan gerrymandering both on the fundamental rights and on the constitutional order as a whole. The majority of the court in Ruccio affirmed that partisan gerrymandering is nothing new in American politics, since the practice was known in the colonies prior to independence, and the framers were familiar with it at the time of the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. Indeed, the history of partisan gerrymandering is the history of American politics and its modern constitutional law. Well, 40 years of litigation in federal and state courts demonstrate the difficulty of addressing a problem on which, fundamentally, the integrity of democracy depends. Preventing the abuse of new technologies from subverting the representative system means preserving the will of the people. When Bandemir, the first landmark case about the topic, was issued in 1986, Justice O'Connor dissenting claimed that, and I quote, political gerrymandering is a self-limiting enterprise because a swing in overall voting strength will tend to cost the legislative majority more and more seats as the gerrymander becomes more ambitious, end quote. So assuming that a wave election would have corrected the distortions of partisan gerrymandering on political representation without the necessity of judicial intervention. According to O'Connor, such a phenomenon could certainly be solved by the electorate or the parties themselves. O'Connor's opinion was definitely a product of that times, and as the brief submitted to the court by political science professors for Ruccio's decision wisely points out, when Justice O'Connor wrote, Pac-Man was still a popular video game, and Microsoft had just released its first Windows, meaning that the technology available at the time did not even remotely allow political parties to access the massive amount of data available today. Nowadays, with the support of sophisticated softwares and the calculus capacity of today's processors, it is possible to profile and predict the behavior of voters in order to draw maps suitable for preserving lasting parliamentary majorities for the electoral cycles of the districting plan. Not by chance, yesterday's gerrymandering is now called, ironically compared to today's precise map-making operation, damimandering, to signify the imprecision and randomness of results obtainable with the then existing techniques. Proof of the durability of the result of modern partisan gerrymandering are the 2018 midterm elections. Significant swings in the popular vote in 2018 brought no electoral shifts in state with gerrymandered districts, demonstrating very low responsiveness to voter preferences, and despite a significant increase in popular support, Democratic candidates generally failed to gain congressional and state legislature seats in state with Republican gerrymanders. Just to mention, in 2018 congressional elections, Democrats won the popular vote nationwide by an 8.6% margin over Republicans, and despite such a margin of popular vote, election results in many districts were inelastic to electoral preferences, as the percentage of the vote for Democratic candidates increased. The distribution of seats in gerrymandered districts remained unchanged from previous electoral cycles, even if some studies show that a 1%, just 1% increase in nationwide votes for a party should, in a responsive map, result in a 2% change in seats for that party. But for parties that access the powerful computers, as we said, huge data sets, individual level data, advanced software, and the latest social science, their gerrymandering efforts were sometimes prone to fail. Conversely, electoral maps are today the result of an intense activity of electorate profiling, collecting and crossing enormous quantities of data coming from the internet, preferences, posts on social networks, online purchases, subscription to magazines and forums, with all the types of data already available from public records, such as residence, family income, party affiliation, ethnicity. It is possible today to reach a prediction of electoral preferences that is almost infallible, allowing the majority party in the state legislature to draw maps with electoral constituencies with a predetermined winner, and thus currently, through algorithms, artificial parliamentary majorities for the electoral cycles to come. Technology thus becomes an instrument to program and maximize the electoral result, subverting the core of representative democracy. Well, regarding the statewide elections of the 2018 cycle, it is worth comparing the election results in Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina with those of Pennsylvania, where the state Supreme Court had declared in February 2018 the unconstitutionality of the previous electoral maps and accordingly supervised a new redistricting. It is evident that with the new map in Pennsylvania, Democrats won 9 seats out of 18 seats with 55.5% of the statewide popular vote. While in North Carolina, for example, despite having a majority in the statewide popular vote, Democrats won only 3 of the 13 congressional seats on the ballot in North Carolina, the same number of seats they had won in previous years. Well, given the potential subversive impact that modern partisan gerrymandering techniques have on the democratic process, it is fair to recognize the merit of Elena Kagan's dissenting opinion shared by Justice Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor in 2019. In that decision, in that dissenting opinion, she pointed out the court's inattention to the impact of modern technologies in redistricting, treating the court this aggressive and subversive contemporary form of gerrymandering in the same way as the imprecise gerrymandering of 1986. Using the same arguments as Sandra O'Connor in 1996 and Justice Scalia in 2004, the Supreme Court in Rucho lacked any comprehensive view of the modern phenomena of gerrymandering and its impact on the representative system. As powerful as current methods are, predictive modeling, another large-scale analytical tool, will become more potent in the near future. But the solution for the majority of the Supreme Court lies instead in the legislative power at federal and state level, and especially in the numerous bills introduced over time in Congress and in the state legislature. According to the court, this is the only constitutional way to limit partisan gerrymandering with no judicial invasion of the authority of the legislative power. However, it is precisely the current majorities in state legislatures that perpetuate and exacerbate the phenomenon. In 241 years, state legislatures have shown very little willingness to correct political gerrymandering. Thus, waiting for such an intervention means assuming that the parties may freely renounce the most effective instrument of preservation of power at their disposal. Exactly because too many owe their seats to partisan gerrymandering, the chances for self-reform, as the poor achievements in this regard attest, are very, very low. Perhaps then the only way to restore a long-violated constitutional rule of law is in the hands of the judiciary. And through the very same technological tools used to facilitate and expand partisan gerrymandering, the courts can determine by fair and quantitative methods the long-chased line between legitimate and illegitimate use of power of apportionment. Well, even if the Supreme Court decision in Rucho in 2019 precluded the involvement of the federal courts in this process, the same cannot be said for state courts. So currently, only state Supreme Courts can address the issue, preventing an uncontrolled expansion of new technologies at the service of partisanship. And the matter is as urgent as ever as the decennial census approaches, and with the census, an aggressive third generation of political gerrymandering is on its way. I have concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nalieri, even to have respect for your time strictly, and your speech highlight a very interesting point. That means that apparently technical and secondary phenomena, as the drawing of electoral constituency, are indeed crucial in the functioning of our liberal democracy, and that the modern gerrymandering is far more risky than the old one. The one became known with the governor Rich Jerry in 1812, even if, as you probably know, the American didn't invent anything new. If we think about the Rotten Borough that was that were in United Kingdom. So thanks again to all the speakers, and now we can start with the second part of our panel with the questions by the audience, and I suggest to collect all the questions and then let the speaker reply to the questions. I cannot read the questions, so are there any questions?
I have one question
Okay.
for one of. Okay, so thank you for
Please, Alessandro, present yourself.
I'm Giovanni Guerra, PhD candidate here in Siena in European and Comparative Public Law. And my question is for Mr. Adriano Rubio. The question, general question. Do you think that the role of consultative bodies will be restored after the COVID pandemic, or these bodies are condemned to lose more and more their roles? In other words, in your opinion, what is the future of the consultative function in the scenario of the constitutional democracy's crisis? That's all.
Yes.
May I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question that I really appreciate. Well, I mean, if I might say something, I think what I try to highlight is that not only that the consulting bodies don't play a role, but if they play it, what's the relationship between the consulting bodies and the decision makers? And when there is a fusion or an interaction between the decision makers and the consulting bodies, I see that as a possible problem, because consulting bodies lack the legitimacy that decision makers have, and if their decision-making process is based basically and solely on consultative decisions and technical expertise, the problem that we face is that voting doesn't matter. Voting doesn't change anything, because at the end of the day, it will always be those hidden, obscure technicians who will make decisions. So what I try to preserve, well, that's where I try to guide my speech, was mostly on that interaction. We have to pay attention to how that interaction between political actors of the executive and technical actors of the executive relates. Because I think that we don't expect from the executive only accuracy, of course we do, efficacy, efficiency, and of course bring the general principles of administrative law and administrative decision making, of course. But we also want, how can I say, a balancing power. If I may say, perhaps we expect the lawmakers to actually be the discussion forum, right? We expect the parliament to actually show and represent different popular views. And as Jeremy Waldron famously said and put, it is basically the place for dissensus, not so much consensus, the parliament. In other words, all voices should have a place, a forum to speak. Whereas the executive, that forum is somehow replaced by participation techniques. In other words, when you have a particular interest, an individual interest with the executive, you want an immigration status, you want a license, you want state aid with your company, whatever, you request it and you are entitled to participate individually and all the interested parties that could be affected. But when the decision making is just saying, as per this report signed by the executive agency, independent authority, whatever you want, I believe that that's missing something. I believe that the executive is just more than efficacy and efficiency. In other words, I believe that taking into consideration different interests creates a more thorough and comprehensive and holistic understanding of what public interest means. And so what I try to highlight is we should reconsider how we should actually understand public interest. Because if the executive is limited to act only in defense and by virtue of public interest, which is what the constitutions of most EU member states say, I believe that we need to really make sure that they balance different interests. In other words, that if we want to put it in philosophical terms, public interest is not univocal, but analogous. And this is what I found, especially with the COVID-19 crisis scenario, in which you see some countries that they said, okay, the public health experts say this, and so my political decision, I sanction basically the technical expertise. And some people or some part of the population wanted that. Let's leave politicians away from decision making. The thing is, public interest, which is the core element of executive decision making, in my opinion, should also take into consideration other interests that are involved in public interest. For example, the economic interests. I know it sounds bad in a pandemic to say this, but I think we should reconcile, balance different interests. And I think that's exactly the mission of the executive. And so an increasing role of consulting bodies could actually jeopardize this balancing attitude. That's the reason why we want some political dimension of the executive. I know it sounds counterintuitive because we want efficacy, efficiency, neutrality, but at the same time, are we really willing to lose the possibility of having a discourse on public utility that is not just said by unelected experts? And so if I have to do a forecast, I say that in different member states, this reaction is different. And it might have something to do with, in my opinion, with the legitimation of administrative action in general. What I mean by this is, perhaps in countries in which the administration is closer to the citizens, I'm thinking about, for example, the Scandinavian countries, in which the administration is basically present in the daily life of most citizens, I think there will be different responses in answering the problem of seeing what voice should the executive power have in decision making. And so, whereas for others, for example, Italy is really prolific. We even heard from one of our colleagues about how prolific the creation of the independent public authority, independent authority or agency. I think that also creates, or even the nature of a purely, mostly technocratic government, which in some countries of Europe would be unthinkable to prescind from the political component. Now, so I think it was just a kind of invitation to take a look at this. Because yes, we want efficacy, we want efficiency, but even those are undetermined concepts. And the definer, the people who will actually define what efficacy, efficiency mean, are not going to be the experts, are always going to be the politicians, because those are the only ones with the legitimacy to issue provvedimenti and also procedimenti.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rubio. Maybe I try to make a question to Mr. Rubio as well, following his argumentation and replying to Mr. Guerra. As far as I understand, your proposal is to strengthen the transparency, openness, and participation in order to rebalance the relationship between expertise, consultative bodies, and executive. But this seems to me a quite old reply to the problems. I mean, participation, it's Administrative Procedure Act in the United States in 1946. Openness and transparency started in the Sunshine Law period in the 60s, and then arrived in Europe some decades later. There is something new that you would like to present, or is all this old stuff? More participation, more transparency, more openness, because it seems that it hasn't worked at all. More transparency, more participation, and so on.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your question. Actually, when I try to say that transparency in itself is not enough. Because I try to highlight also the insufficiency of the contemporary mechanisms to guarantee some sort of not only transparency and accountability, but also access to information. So my proposal is more through, and I only open this door at the end, through the motivation requirement, which is an old requirement, due to give reasons by the executive. But somehow, and it's not only a transparency requirement, and not only an accountability requirement, but it's somehow the construction of a new rapport with the citizens. In other words, so I think our democracies and even the administrative action has evolved also by the Europeanization of the right to good administration, Article 41 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And I think this is where the potentiality is. Of course, transparency and accountability will be the main ingredients, but not only. For example, I believe understandability is another dimension of transparency and accountability. Now, the right to know how different public interests have been considered. Whether access to documents and minutes would suffice, my intuition is like yours. It's like, it's not going to be enough, and it's not going to increase the overall sense of transparency and accountability. But I think the motivation required could play a big role in making decision-making more, not only participatory, but also more democratic. So that we know that they preferred to sacrifice, for example, in the COVID case, some politicians or some regional governments, for example, put first, for example, safeguarding public health measures, whereas others preferred, for example, to guarantee to avoid the economic ruin of the small businesses. And so knowing this in a liberal system would allow us somehow to vote with the feet, or to know different mechanisms of understanding, different comprehensions of what public utility might mean. In other words, my biggest fear right now is that we lose faith in the constitutional democracy, especially in the increasing technification of the executive. We want efficacy, yes. At any cost, yes and no. And also, we also have to think that on top of this, that the Europeanization of member states, and even at the regional level, is still present, the European character of our member states. I think perhaps some of those guarantees for efficiency and efficacy could come from above. And we could always have some supranational guarantee that weird decisions or crazy decisions will not happen. By the way, in Spain, my own country, this is the public, I'm not going to talk for all Spain, but in the popular discourse, this is the idea. Nothing terrible will happen because Europe will never allow it. For example, no fascism will be in Spain. No communism will be in Spain because we are part of the EU. So EU will protect us against those extreme anti-democratic positions. So I believe that national member states and also regional and more subsidiary infra-state levels should play with that duty to give reasons to actually not only increase participation, not only to increase transparency, but also to make a different, how can I say, a different dialectical discourse with citizens. In other words, so that we feel treated as old citizens, not old citizens, but mature citizens that can understand that big decisions and hard decisions are made, but at least we know then how to keep them accountable. So it's not just transparency for the sake of transparency. I think it's a means for accountability, but it doesn't exhaust accountability. Whether there is a new possible response that is not from the traditional paradigm on transparency and accountability, I'm still trying to find that out. But I think that the digitalization of public administration could also play a role here in guaranteeing that crazy, irrational, or unreasonable decisions are not made. So we still have to think about the human nature of decision making. And so there could be new facades, new faces, a little bit of traditional problems, because I believe this is a traditional problem. So I don't know if I responded.
No, it's okay. I thank you very much, and I see your point. In some respect, I agree with you. I just like you to consider 2 points. That more basing all your consideration on motivation could produce more acceptance by the addressee, but not more power to the addressee. I mean, the people would not be more powerful if they know and accept a clear motivation, a very extended motivation. And second point is that more power, if you look especially to the motivation, you will give for sure more powers to judges, not to the public opinion, because it would be the judges that will review the motivation of the consultative bodies. But sorry, I don't want to focus on only on your papers. There are any other questions for the other speakers?
Yes, we are a question for
Okay.
Yeah, I have a, sorry. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I have a question for Giacomo, actually, because I got inspired during Adrian's last intervention, and it relates mostly about so you talked about the expansion of judicial powers, but more broadly, maybe it could be interesting to understand this phenomenon, taking into consideration the role of science and data in the role of as judges decide. So this, I was brainstorming this as I read the latest decision that you mentioned, on the Klimaschutzgesetz, and there are pages and pages dedicated to technical data and scientific data. And it's interesting that, so this judicial activism is changing it's changing dimension, and science is coming in with all of its, preponderance and emphasis. So maybe it's interesting to analyze this expansion in light of the role of science as well, and how this can, create its effects in the democratic institution.
Thank you very much for your suggestion. I will for sure consider also this point in writing my paper, so in the written part, and for sure new data and new technologies in general play a big role if we just consider the development of privacy and many other new rights. Of course, courts also, not just constitutional courts, but for instance, the Court of Justice of the European Union, so at a supranational level, played a very big role. So for sure, I will also focus and take into account also this aspect, and thank you very much for highlighting it. Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the audience? Ci sono altre domande? You have any question for the other speakers? Ok, so grazie a tutti della partecipazione e chiudiamo qui il nostro panel. Ci vedremo domani mattina e nel pomeriggio faremo un riassunto di quello che è stato detto oggi, tutte le cose molto interessanti che abbiamo ascoltato. Grazie moltissimo a tutti i relatori, ai partecipanti e buon pomeriggio.
Grazie, arrivederci.
See you, bye bye.
Bye, arrivederci.
Thank you, bye bye.
Thank you.
Grazie ragazzi.